Hey, so this is a boxing video for boxing fans. Well, anyone's welcome to watch, but if you're not interested in boxing, this obviously won't be of much interest to you. I want to talk about the issue of peak. Um, Also a little bit about corruption and the whole concept of a mismatched fight in terms of a fighter going past his best and a guy facing him who doesn't really get the credit because people consider that said fighter is past his best. So, I'm partly responding actually to a comment I'd made on the Mike Tyson Kevin McBride fight. Kevin McBride, of course, was Mike Tyson's last opponent, and it was generally seen that Tyson was past his peak. Um, I'd agree with that, but I think when we talk about peak in boxing, we need to be very clear what we mean by that. Obviously, it means the time when a fighter is considered to be his or her best, but I think that it's quite a vague concept because, generally speaking, there isn't a very clear consensus on what is peak. You get some fighters retiring when they're still pretty damn good, and they're still relatively young. Take Carl Froch, for example. He's just retired. He's 37 now. Okay, in boxing terms, a while back that would have been considered old, but when you consider there's a lot of fighters going well into the 40s, 37 is a pretty normal, reasonable age to retire. The point being that Carl Froch could probably have quite a few more fights and people would still think he was a credible threat. So the whole notion of peak really needs to be clearly defined. And it does vary with different fighters. Now I've heard it said that I think it was Lennox Lewis said that in the heavyweight division it takes longer for a fighter to peak. Mike Tyson is an exception to that rule because obviously he won the world heavyweight title at the age of just 20. I think Tyson's a bit unusual because he peaked at a very young age and he was really a ruthless force. What we consider the late 80s, he was like a force of nature. That's where the whole Kid Dynamite thing comes in. But throughout the 90s, people forget actually Tyson was very evenly matched in most of his fights. And I wouldn't use the word dominated, but certainly evenly matched in the Holyfield fights and most of the fights of the 90s, and certainly the early 2000s. It's fair to say Tyson was a shadow of his former self. But this is the thing I want to talk about, because very often it's the case that when a great is beaten later in his career, the guy who beats him just doesn't get the credit, partly because people are saying, well, look, the guy's past his best. Now, on one hand, this makes sense because the logic is, well, if said person had faced him earlier, he wouldn't have been beaten. There's many famous examples of this. We think of Rocky Marciano and the guys he fought, Joe Louis, Archie Moore, Jersey Joe Walcott. They were all older men, although Marciano is still very highly ranked. Joe Calzaghe, one of the main detractions against him is the fact that the two most famous fighters he beat, Roy Jones Jr. and Bernard Hopkins, were past their best. Now, with Roy Jones Jr., there might be a valid argument with that. But with Bernard Hopkins, consider the fact that he is now a rated fighter, now a rated fighter at 50 years old. You know, you get a lot of fighters who fight well past their best. Virgil Hill's an example, but they've long since not been rated. Bernard Hopkins is an exception. He's not nicknamed the Alien for nothing because he's a man of exceptional fitness for his age. So when we're talking about peak, I would make the point that it varies from fighter to fighter. Therefore, when Joe Calzaghe beat Bernard Hopkins, he was at his peak because he's seen at his peak now. Um, or if not at his peak, he's still seen as extremely fit. So certainly in the Hopkins fight, I don't think that Calzaghe gets all the credit he deserves. In Britain, he's generally pretty highly respected, but stateside, he still doesn't quite get that respect. Um, what I would say is if you're going to apply the whole age thing, and bear in mind Calzaghe's an unbeaten fighter, if you're going to apply the age logic, then you have to apply exactly the same logic to Rocky Marciano as you do to Joe Calzaghe. I see very little difference there. Both men beat all-time greats. Both men were undefeated. Marciano probably gets a lot more credit than Calzaghe, possibly because the heavyweight division, there's a certain aura to being the only undefeated heavyweight. Also because Marciano was a sheer power puncher. Calzaghe was a hard hitter, but more not really seen as like a power puncher in the same way. Um, so when we talk about peak, I think this is a very important thing that each individual fighter is unique and different fighters peak at different times. Although it's generally around, I would say about two-thirds into a fighter's career. Between one-third and two-thirds into a fighter's career, that's the sort of period where he or she peaks. Um, but it isn't universal. Some fighters are still very dangerous very late into their career. Um, Regarding Mike Tyson, and I made this point before, I do think that there is more excuses made for him than any other fighter. Um, and this is where I want to mention the issue of corruption in boxing. And a lot of people say that, for example, with the McBride fight, he only took the fight because he needed the money. Well, I'd certainly believe that. But, in the end of the day, Mike Tyson's an adult. He made the choice to take the fight. I'm well aware that there is very unpleasant parasitical figures in the world of boxing, and it's a very unfortunate side to this sport. But in the end of the day, some fighters are more responsible. You know, um, I do agree that Tyson had the disadvantage of getting so much attention so young, and that kind of derailed him, and the death of Costamato and all those sort of things. But the problem I have with Tyson, that hardcore Tyson fans, is they don't really apply the same standards to other fighters. Now, the sort of challenges that Mike Tyson faced as a fighter, you could apply that to a lot of working class fighters. There's a lot of other kids from Brooklyn who had a very tough background. You could apply a lot of the same sort of issues they faced, that is used to excuse Mike Tyson's challenges. Now, just be clear, I respect Tyson as a fighter. I think he's certainly an extraordinary fighter. Okay, so I'm not being, but sometimes I have a problem with, and I don't want to make this whole video about Mike Tyson, but I'm just mentioning this because he is very often used as the fighter that people most excuse. Um, they'll say he was corrupted by Don King. He went off track when his manager died, etc., etc., etc. But you can get any number of fighters who have similar emotional challenges, and people don't use the same excuses. Like they don't go out of their way to kind of discredit the opposition and excuse the fighter. In the end of the day, if you're a professional sportsman, you're being paid a lot of money. You've got some responsibility. Now, as far as I'm concerned, it's understandable, certainly in the early years after the Douglas loss, why Tyson went off the rails. No excuse for some of the things he's done, incidentally. And I think that's another problem I have with hardcore Tyson fans. They just outright excuse some of his criminal behavior. Um, you know, Stop acting like the guy is a saint. He's not. What pisses me off about some Tyson fans is they really act like he's some sort of messiah, like he's a philosopher, a prophet, or something like this. In the end of the day, he's a very talented boxer who has a very long criminal record. This isn't someone who should be glorified. Respected as a fighter, okay, but even as a fighter, I would still contend that Mike Tyson is overrated, and I know it's blasphemous to say that, but I would be very happy to lay out the reasons why I think that is the case. Um, Firstly, getting the title at 20 was an incredible feat, and he will always deserve respect for that. But in terms of his KO rate, it's a bit over. I think it's a bit exaggerated because actually, if you look at the Ring Magazine list of KO streaks, Mike Tyson isn't even in the top 10. That's something that is sometimes overstated. Um, what actually happened was, and also if you look at the quality of his opposition, I mean, those guys were rated. They were good fighters. You know, I'm talking about guys like Pinklon Thomas, Tony Tucker, etc. They're all good fighters. I'm not disrespecting them, but none of them were really all-time greats. He beat Larry Holmes, and then this comes back down to the past the peak argument. And the irony about this is for Tyson's later fights, people make excuses. Um, and say, oh, Tyson was past his peak. But one second, Tyson beat past his peak Larry Holmes, so why not apply the same logic there? You know, people act like Tyson was this force of nature, and he was certainly a very menacing figure. But the point is, you have to ask the question, if he'd been in with an Evander Holyfield or a Lennox Lewis in those early years, are we absolutely certain that he would have dominated them the way that people claim? No, we're not certain at all. The thing is, that's pure conjecture. You just can't know. I might be wrong. Maybe he would have dominated them, but there's no way to know. This is the thing about boxing. Unless two men face each other in the ring, you'll never know. It's pointless speculating on that sort of stuff. Fantasy fights are fun, you know, they're interesting, but in the end of the day, they really are just conjecture. You just cannot know for certain. Because for one thing, surprises happen in boxing. Um, anyway, I don't want to just focus here on Mike Tyson because I have made a specific video before on that. But I want to talk about the responsibility that fighters have themselves. Look, I'm not stupid. I know in the sport of boxing there's some very sleazy, corrupt figures, and promoters are kind of up there with terrorists in terms of reputation. You know, they're not seen as morally s- steady figures. They're seen as very morally corrupt figures. Although you need promoters for the sport. It's a fact. And I don't think that every promoter is a callous, cold-blooded figure. I don't think that's the case. But in the end of the day, boxing's big money. It is business. These guys do what they're meant to do. No excuse for corruption, of course, but anyway, the point I'm making here is that if you're going to apply certain standards to one fighter, then you have to be consistent in that. You cannot just apply those standards to a certain fighter because you like that fighter. So if you're a Mike Tyson fan, all the excuses you're making for Mike Tyson, fair enough, provide that those sort of I won't say excuses. I'll be polite here and say those reasons that you're providing for Mike Tyson. At least be consistent and then concede, well, okay, those same things can be used for other fighters. The problem I have is people really do act like Mike Tyson has a VIP status. That's ridiculous. Um, anyway, I'll round this up pretty soon, but there's a few things I want to leave with this video. First of all, when we're talking about peak, we really need to be clear about that because it varies from fighter to fighter, and I think there's a lot of debate around that. Secondly, people forget that very often boxers are not in control of who they fight, especially if you're an up and coming fighter. Very often you'll just have to take what you get. I mean, it's very unreasonable to expect a young fighter to people to turn around and say, "Oh, you never fought the guy when he was in his peak." But it could well be that the guy was in his peak when the up and coming young fighter was 10 years old. So it's ridiculous to expect them. And you know, if you're a young fighter and you're trying to make your name, are you going to turn down a fight from a world class boxer just because he may be past his peak? Of course, you're not going to do that. And unfortunately, sometimes young guys don't get the credit they deserve. You know, they've done nothing wrong. They've done the training. They've done everything they had to do. They beat the guy. A well-known example of this in Britain was when a young Joe Bugner beat Henry Cooper when he was just, I think he was 22 at the time. Now, instead of getting the credit, and it was his birthday incidentally, instead of getting the credit for putting in a tough fight and beating generally acknowledged very impressive, very great fighter, at least in British circles, he got jeered and people disrespected him because of basically because of emotions. They loved Henry Cooper, so they hate the guy that beats him. But you know, Joe Bugner had done nothing wrong. He'd done everything he had to do. He won the fight, and he just didn't get the credit for it. And another thing, when decisions go the wrong way, it's stupid people showing hate against the fighter. if you have an issue with the result, take it up with the judges or the referee. And even then, be fair about it. Don't be. But sometimes, people blame the fight themselves. I suspect in most cases, okay, you do get corruption, you do get fighters throwing fights because they're controlled by the mafia and so on. Um, I think every fighter has to be very careful with that to know who they're connected with. But the truth is, there's some very sleazy, unsavory figures in the sport who would never have the guts to enter a ring themselves, but have no problem, making money off another man's blood, basically, or another man risking his health. Um, Truth is, I'm a boxing fan, but the corruption in this sport is one thing that I concede is very off-putting. Um, but all I'm saying here is that people need to be consistent in their critique. They need to be clear about what they mean by peak. And I think it's unfair to blame fighters sometimes for who they are fighting. Yes, it's true that when you get a bit more established, when you have titles and so on, you have a bit more choice. But people forget if you're a contender, you have to take what you get. And you can get a very brave young contender who's calling out all the names he wants. That doesn't mean that that person's going to come to them. And years later, people say, "Oh, you never fought this guy when he was at his peak." But wait a second, he tried to. It's boxing politics. Very often, young fighters do not have a choice. They have to fight who they fight. They can't always fight the best of the best. And it's very characteristic of young fighters to be hungry for a title. Now, they may have a trainer or a manager who sees the bigger picture and realizes it's not good for them at that time in their career. So my point is, you have to understand that fighters most of the time don't have a choice over who they're fighting, especially if they're contenders. I understand the criticism of champions who don't fight the best. I do understand that because that's different. They have more of a choice. That's why I totally understand criticism of Floyd Mayweather if he doesn't face the most dangerous guys out there because he does have a choice. Um, anyway, I'll leave it there. But I think there's a lot of important points to take from this. Feel free to leave a comment, but I do ask you to keep it respectful because this is all debate. It's all opinions. There's no need to be disrespectful, and very often in boxing forums it descends to the gutter. So, guys, feel free to leave a comment. If you're a Mike Tyson fan, feel free to share your thoughts, but keep it respectful. I'm trying to be respectful here. I'm just sharing my opinions. I'm not trying to disrespect any fighter or anything like that. So leave your thoughts, but keep it respectful. Cheers.